Namaskar and a hearty welcome to today's meeting. And thank you, Matajis, for the lovely song. Last month, we had a talk on the challenge of spiritual life. In that talk, we heard something about the value of training and equipment that are necessary for the adventure that is spiritual life. You'll remember that we discussed a handful of qualities like strength, faith, effort, determination, and endurance. These qualities are indispensable if we want to reach our goal. Today's talk, Preparing the Ground, will be a continuation of the same theme, and we will hear something about what we may call the conditions of spiritual life. Because the theme is more or less the same as last time, there's going to be some overlap of ideas. There'll be some overlap of ideas, and a couple of ideas will even be repeated. But considering the vital importance of these couple of qualifications or conditions, I think it is certainly good and even necessary to remind ourselves of them again and again. For that matter, nothing that I'm going to say now is new to you, but these are things that bear repeating. Anyhow, last time I mentioned faith. Faith in the spiritual ideal and faith in one's own capacity to realize that ideal. Now, even long before the highest realization dawns upon us, it is possible for us to have a fairly clear and a strong faith in the divine. Because this idea is embedded in the very depths of our being. The very first condition of spiritual life is the awakening of this faith in us. Our soul is a reflection of the divine, and this soul reflects the divine light even when we are not able to directly see the light itself. It's a universal experience that all of us want to live eternally, to know everything, and to be always happy. Why? Because that is our own true nature. Sat Chit Ananda. The body, mind, or the senses can't be eternal because they are ever changing. But separate, distinct from all these, there is in us an I consciousness that doesn't change. When we try to think of a soul or spiritual consciousness within, which somehow has gotten mixed up with our thoughts and our physical consciousness, when we try to think of that, we are actually making an inquiry into the nature of the ultimate reality itself, into the nature of Sat Chit Ananda. This is a fact. However, until we have actually realized this truth, we have to go on with some idea or conception of the ultimate reality. And side by side, in every case, our faith, our belief has to be verified. If belief is based on reality, it will be strengthened and vitalized. If it is not based on reality, it may go on for a while and then it will disappear. The goal of human life is freedom. Freedom from fear, from suffering, from the toils and sufferings of repeated births and deaths. Plus the attainment of supreme, everlasting peace, Jivan Mukti and Parama Sukha Prapti. And the means of attaining these is self-knowledge, Atma Jnana. That is what Vedanta has for ages proclaimed. The first condition of spiritual life is faith in the spiritual ideal, the ideal of self-realization. This ideal must be fixed and be clear even at the beginning of spiritual life. We must have a very definite idea of the path and a definite idea of the goal that we want to attain. That is to say, the ultimate goal of life. So long as we allow ourselves to be vague and unclear in this matter, there will be a continual conflict within us which will prevent many of us from advancing even a single step towards that goal. In the vast majority of people who do turn to spiritual life, there is too much superficial thinking, shallow feeling, indefinite willing and acting, without any real intense aspiration, without a clear-cut purpose or a deep awareness of these things. There is an interesting anecdote in Zen Buddhist literature. A monk asks a Zen master, they say when a lion seizes his prey, whether it is a rabbit or an elephant, he puts forth all his power in one concentrated effort. What is the nature of this power? And the master says, total, complete sincerity. The power of non-deception. It's a strange phrase. The power of non-deception. This is something very significant. Non-deception means not cheating oneself, not deceiving oneself, putting forth one's whole being. This is what Sri Ramakrishna meant when he would warn, let there be no theft in the chamber of the heart. The whole being is in action. Nothing is kept in reserve, nothing expressed under a disguise, nothing going waste. Then the Zen master continues, when a man lives like this, with total commitment, then he is said to be a golden-maned lion, the symbol of virility, sincerity, and wholeheartedness. In other words, what is needed in spiritual life is faith in one's ability to realize one's own true self. This faith channelizes all our energies in the right direction. Doubt is a very big danger and can obstruct all progress in spiritual life. It comes to all beginners at some time or other. Doubt means lack of faith in oneself and in the divine, and it can't be removed completely until the realization of the divine is attained. However, we shouldn't allow ourselves to be overpowered by doubt. We must not let it cripple us, nor must we waver in our determination to progress in spiritual life. We should have the ideal fixed in our minds that pleasure or enjoyment is not our goal, here or hereafter. Our only goal as human beings should be self-realization. Because heavenly enjoyment is no better than earthly enjoyment. And so long as there is in us a hankering after enjoyment, for pleasure, we can never attain the goal. Enjoyment is a cheap thing after all. This every soul will realize sooner or later. The point is, we can't lead an out-and-out worldly life and the higher life at the same time. We can't run after human love and have divine love as well at the same time. Worldly ambitions and spiritual aspirations can't be combined. Where desire is, there God cannot be. Where God is, there desire cannot be. No one can serve two masters. You can't serve both God and the world. We know all these great sayings. So we should closely examine ourselves and find out whether we really want God. If we desire things of the world, we don't really need God. We can do without Him. If we are happy and satisfied when these things are granted to us, it is a sure sign that we don't want God. So we should ask ourselves now and then whether it is really God that we want or something else. If it is really God, we can be sure that He will come to us, because God always comes to the devotee who seeks Him and Him alone. These are Sri Ramakrishna's words. If the devotee moves towards God one step, God comes towards him 10 steps. Our whole problem is that we believe this phenomenal world to be intensely real, and the two realities can't have room in us at the same time. So what to do? First of all, a void has to be created in our heart, and once this is done, we can fill this void with the divine. To put it very simply, first we have to clear the jungle within, and then we'll be able to raise the garden in its place. The fact is, whatever we take to be real, whatever we think to be true and permanent, draws our entire being. It absorbs our whole mind, attracts all our feeling. There's an important law in spiritual life. And according to Vedanta, nothing is real that doesn't remain unchanged under all circumstances. Real is that alone which was in the past, which is in the present, and which will remain in the future without undergoing any change. Everything that changes or decays belongs to the category of the unreal. A little boy was once asked by his mother, "What is a dream?" And the boy answers, "It is like watching a movie with closed eyes." We can also experience the waking state in the same way, provided we have that little boy's purity of heart and his inner simplicity. When we analyze ourselves and the world, what do we perceive? What do we find? We find that consciousness alone remains unchanged. Pure consciousness is like a movie screen on which the passing show of the world is projected. So Swami Vivekananda said, "God alone lives, the soul alone lives, spirituality alone lives." Hold on to that. We must have firm faith in this statement. We should never try to lower the ideal. We should rather struggle to measure ourselves up to the ideal. If the ideal is too high, we must have a working ideal to serve as a stepping stone to reach that high ideal, which is the goal of our life. Until we attain the highest ideal, self-realization, we should not compromise. If we fail in our attempt to reach this high ideal, let us know that we have only failed. But we should persist with greater vigor and determination to reach it. We should never run after low, unworthy ideals. Because for a person who wants to live a life committed to spiritual life, committed to the spiritual ideal, a reversal of values is deadly. This is something we should never forget. A reversal of values. So, that was so much about faith. Then the second vital condition is the ability to separate the essentials from the non-essentials. If we mistake the non-essentials of religion for real spiritual life and get lost in them, we'll never make any spiritual progress. This is the fate of the so-called orthodox people. Despite all their strict observance of moral and religious codes, they remain where they are. They have just missed the mark. Spirituality is something different from and much more than book knowledge or information gathering. Nowadays, information is available everywhere. Information about religions and the different forms of spirituality, bringing the message of different traditions in different forms. But through mere information gathering, through mere intellectual study, we can never know the truth. When we think too much and too highly of a mere intellectual life, we can never realize the essential truths of religions and spirituality. Shankaracharya writes in one of his great Upanishadic commentaries, "Let the aspirant study as best as he can. master the subjects. But after having become a scholar, let him renounce desires and try to live upon the strength that comes from that knowledge. And almost all of us here know Shankaracharya's famous Bhaja Govindam, where he strongly advises an old Pandit not to continue to waste his time on scholarship at his age, but to turn his mind to God, which is the one essential thing. Sri Ramakrishna also said, "What will a Pandit's scholarship profit him if he doesn't think of God and has no discrimination and renunciation? Of what use is erudition if the mind dwells on worldly things? The Pandit has no doubt studied many books and scriptures. He may rattle off their texts, or he may even have written books, but if he is attached to pleasure, if he thinks of money and honor as the essential things, will you call him a Pandit? How can a man be a Pandit if his mind doesn't dwell on God?" So, having known the essentials of spiritual life, having formed a clear conception of the ideal, we should get down to practice. There is no need to read or know too much. That only creates disturbance and trouble. I again quote the words of Shankaracharya: "The mass of words in the scriptures is like a dense forest that confuses the mind. So the wise person should struggle to know the nature of the true self. Scholarship, learning, oratory, and skill in explaining the scriptures only give pleasure to the intellectual, but they don't liberate the soul." These are the words of Shankaracharya himself. Now, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't study. What is meant is that there has to be a higher purpose. The purpose of our study should be to realize the truth. You know Sri Ramakrishna's parable of the man who received a letter from home. It contained a list of presents to be sent to his relatives. After knowing the contents, the man threw away the letter and then went and bought the things. So, study is always encouraged in Vedanta, but along with studies, there has to be some real, regular spiritual practice. We must train our intellect through regular studies, but we also need to reflect deeply on the questions of life and reality. This twofold discipline of study and introspection, this has to be made an important item in our daily spiritual practice. You know, Buddha made it the mission of his life to tell people to give up the externals of religion and to live a life of spirituality, a life of purity, mind control, spiritual discipline, and meditation. Without these, nobody can expect to become spiritual or make any progress. All that then remains nothing but a fond dream. Buddha didn't even speak of God. You know that he didn't say anything about God at all, because it is not necessary to talk about God so much. It is far more important to follow God's path, to live the spiritual life. People often lose themselves, as Sri Ramakrishna used to say. People often lose themselves in admiration of God's creation, but they forget that the Creator is greater than His creation. From our human standpoint, we may find intellectual attainments great or grand, but in God's eyes, it is a very small thing after all. So it is more important to see God than to praise Him for His external splendors. Buddha neither affirmed nor denied God's existence. He just wanted to stop all futile speculation and make people do something to free themselves from pain and sorrow. He famously said, "When the house is on fire, do you try to find out the origin of the fire? Or do you set about extinguishing it?" But because we don't feel the urgency of the problem, we busy ourselves finding out the origin of the fire. And before we succeed in the attempt, the house is burned down and nothing is left but a heap of ashes. So, it is vital that we learn to separate the essentials of religion and spirituality from the non-essentials. Now, that takes great struggle. It's a struggle to go beyond the thought world that we have been building up all our lives. This hard work is what is generally known as self-effort in the books. Many people are unwilling to abandon it. They are either too weak or too lazy to work against their own minds. They want everything to be done for them by others, by their gurus, by their spiritual guides. But unfortunately, there is no vicarious salvation without any self-effort on the part of the aspirant. As we already heard last time, before we actually begin our spiritual life in right earnest, we must decide if we are really and fully prepared to pay the price for it. Generally, we have two tendencies in us: the spiritual and the worldly. If both are more or less equally strong in the beginning, then the spiritual tendency must be strengthened. Otherwise, the tug of war within can never be overcome. That is why it is absolutely necessary for us to fix our goal once for all and then stick to it, whatever happens. If we really wish to follow this difficult path, so full of pitfalls and dangers, we must also be prepared to face and overcome all those difficulties. If we wish to transcend unrealities, we have to have a certain amount of fearlessness and heroism in us. Unless we are ready to sacrifice our worldly desires, ambitions, and goals, and our own sense of I and mine, we can never realize the spiritual ideal. If spiritual life means the purification and sublimation, by sublimation I mean the redirection of our feelings, it also means at the same time strengthening our willpower and forcing the mind to take to the higher path. The mind and its powers have to be wholly directed towards the higher life. It is not that we don't have any willpower. People do have great willpower and concentration, But because both are given a worldly direction, it leads them deeper and deeper into the world. All of us want to be spiritual. We want to be able to meditate always, to be absorbed in spiritual thoughts always. But unfortunately, the mind rebels. According to yoga, this stubbornness, this obstinacy of the mind is caused by samskaras. These samskaras make exercising the will in the right direction difficult. But samskaras can be changed or even destroyed totally by doing good actions, by associating with good people. We gain good samskaras. Not only that, by persistently exercising our willpower in the right direction, we can gradually strengthen it. Then spiritual life becomes much easier. Swami Yatishwarananda ji used to say, God's grace comes in the form of self-effort. The sign that we have received God's grace is that we feel a great urge to exercise our willpower in the right direction, to blast away all obstacles on our spiritual path. So, self-effort is needed to become conscious of our unity with the divine. When we purify our minds and put our will, try at least to put our will in tune with the divine will, then the conflict between self-effort and divine grace ceases. These two, self-effort and divine grace, they are not so different from one another as it seems. Now, where do all these things lead? Faith, focus on essentials, and struggle. Where do they take us? What is the next stage? All this, and especially this conscious struggle, slowly, unperceived by ourselves, it brings about a revision of our own ideas about ourselves and of others. We need to do some rethinking on our relationships. Spiritual life must bring about a change of outlook on the world. Those who are bound by family ties should try to sublimate their existing relationships. If other people don't understand our attitude or don't like it, that is no reason why we should dance according to their tune beyond a certain point. If there is no mutual agreement regarding spiritual life, we have to be bold and take a unilateral decision in the matter. We must learn to establish relationships with others only through the divine. Once we accept the spiritual ideal, then we must demonstrate it in our outlook, in our attitudes, and also in our relationships. Now, there are two dangers we have to avoid in spiritual life. One is to love other people with human love and falsely call it divine love. The other is to become insensitive even to the right feelings and become totally selfish. In fact, that is a greater danger. Both are harmful to spiritual life. But in order to love and serve others in the proper way, we have to first try to reflect the divine in our own life and actions. If we are successful there, if we become really holy, then even silence will be more effective than the usual emotional expressions. It is possible to be loving, kind, and considerate towards others without getting attached to them. So everything depends upon our change of attitude towards ourselves. So, spiritual life should bring about a change in our outlook on God and the world. But this is possible only when it brings about a change of our outlook on ourselves. This is the most important thing to know in spiritual life. Unless we start regarding ourselves as the spirit, as the soul separate from the body and mind, we haven't even begun spiritual life. Our old images about ourselves must be replaced by a new self-image. In fact, this change of outlook on oneself is what distinguishes a true spiritual aspirant from the average so-called religious people. At first, when the change takes place, we may not have any clear idea of what the soul or self really means. But whatever our conception, it is enough to think about it as something separate, something pure, separate from the body and mind, and identify ourselves with it. But sometimes we are so much accustomed to our ignorance that we don't want a new life. We are so accustomed to our false ego that we can't bear the brilliant light of our own true self. As a matter of fact, there are plenty of people who silently suffer from serious mental disorders because of leading divided, fragmented lives. They suffer from no clinically identifiable neurosis, but from the senselessness and emptiness of their lives. So let us at least learn how to take care of ourselves, how to realize the ideal of a full, holistic life. One of the Upanishads points out, in the case of human beings, their mind alone is the cause of bondage or liberation. That is why Sri Krishna also says, "Let a man uplift himself by his own higher self. Let him not lower himself. For he himself is his friend, and he himself is his enemy." To him who has conquered himself, his own self is a friend. But to him who has not conquered himself, his own self becomes hostile like an external enemy. On the one hand, they sound very depressing. But on the other, these words are so full of hope because our lives are in our own hands. And yet, so many aspirants become defeatist and throw themselves at the mercy of fate. The same thing has happened also in Christianity, despite what Jesus taught. Jesus said, "Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." He meant spiritual striving. Be perfect. Not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. So we see that Jesus taught a dynamic spiritual life, a life of intense struggle. This was the life lived by the great Christian mystics. And still, because of so much stress on ideas of sin, vicarious atonement, easy salvation, because of such ideas, many active, successful people have been hypnotized into believing that they won't be able to do anything for themselves on the spiritual plane. It is such a sad thing. And what is the result? This wrong belief has taken away people's spiritual initiative. And so, a tremendous amount of human energy is diverted solely for material purposes. There is such an overemphasis on material achievements and an equal, utter neglect of the spiritual ideal. We modern people see enemies everywhere and fight them with all our might. But we forget that within ourselves we have far worse enemies waiting to destroy us morally and spiritually. We could use our fighting spirit more effectively in fighting our own lower nature, our own lower self, our own egos. Our ego is ill because it is cut off from the whole, from the rest of humanity. And it has lost its connection with the universal spirit. Patanjali's yoga describes how the soul is swayed by ignorance. This spiritual ignorance, avidya, is not a negative thing that you can dismiss or forget about, because it has created this dangerous fantasy of the ego. It is egotism produces attachment, attachment leads to aversion, and the result of this chain reaction is a terrible clinging to life and suffering. These are the pancha kleshas: avidya, asmita, raga, dvesha, and abhinivesha. So, from the standpoint of psychology, we may say the ego is ill. But from the standpoint of spirituality, the ego itself is the illness. To be egocentric is to be spiritually ill. The remedy for this illness, as you have all heard many times over, the remedy for this illness is yoga. All spiritual paths, the yogas, are designed to cure the illness of the ego. In Karma Yoga, the results of all our actions are dedicated to the divine in a spirit of self-surrender. Every action becomes a self-offering, and the selfish ego is conquered in the end. In Raja Yoga, the mind is concentrated on higher and higher dimensions of our personality. In the process, the soul finds out that it is not the mind or the ego, but a separate spiritual entity. We try to get rid of the ego by dwelling on the true nature of the self, and this destroys the great illusion that confuses it with the body and the mind. In Jnana Yoga, we go even further. From individual consciousness, we rise to cosmic consciousness. The ego becomes merged in Brahman. Even the subtlest form of I consciousness is destroyed. However, the easiest for people like us the easiest and the most natural is the practice of Bhakti Yoga. Here we worship God in several different ways with intense love and devotion. If properly practiced, Bhakti Yoga through Bhakti Yoga, our lives become one continuous act of service to the Lord. And through this service, the ego gradually loses its evil nature and becomes a pure instrument in the Lord's hands. In Sri Ramakrishna's words, the unripe ego is transformed into the ripe ego. He used to say, all troubles come to an end when this ego dies. As long as the ego is alive, we can have neither jnana nor moksha, but when the ego is transcended, the same bound jiva becomes the ever-free Shiva. In fact, advanced yogis are said to actually feel the separateness of the self, not only from the body but also from the mind. They say, as one practices moral and spiritual disciplines of yoga, one comes to possess a sharp awareness of the individual spirit dwelling within the specific human body. What we think of as separateness is actually due to a division of the mind. What is divided is not the spirit, but the mind. But the purity that the practice of yoga brings about awakens a new sense, an intuition that reveals to us that we are neither the body nor the mind. The yogi finds great joy in this realization that the soul can be separated from the body, that one is not really bound by the limitations of human life. When we forget this truth about our real self and identify ourselves with the ego, it is then that we become playthings in the hands of nature. We lose our freedom and we are at nature's mercy. The more egocentric we are, the harder spiritual life is for us. So, a certain amount of ego reduction is an essential prerequisite for all people who wish to embark on the spiritual adventure. Without a spirit of dispassion, without a spirit of acceptance of moral correctives, without a spirit of self-surrender to the divine, spiritual life becomes extremely difficult. Therefore, we should strive to bring about a total change in our outlook about ourselves, towards God, and towards the world. So, to recap today's main points. 1. Faith in the ideal and in oneself. 2. Separating the essentials from the non-essentials. 3. Struggle or self-effort. And 4. Change of attitude towards oneself, the world, and God. Fulfilling these important conditions of spiritual life is what preparing the ground is all about. Thank you. That's all for today. Next Sunday, that is the 18th, we will be observing Holy Mother's Puja with the special worship. The function will begin at 11 o'clock. And on the following Saturday, not Sunday, Sunday is Christmas, but on the 24th, we'll be celebrating Christmas Eve as usual after evening Arati. You're all most heartily welcome. Thank you. And now our dear Kaushik Prakhyat will present us with one more beautiful song.